Hello, and welcome to SFMA's post-conference webinar series. I'm Jennifer McClendon, Education Manager for SFMA, and today our speaker is Geoff Rinehart. Geoff Rinehart has 22 years experience in the turfgrass and landscape industry, working in various parts of the country. He earned a bachelor's degrees in turfgrass management and landscape contracting from Virginia Tech and a Master of Science in Turfgrass Science at Michigan State University. After graduating from Michigan State, Geoff spent 5.5 years as a research technician conducting turfgrass science research at Washington State University and spent 4 years coordinating the Tacoma-Pierce County Natural Yard Care Program, conducting outreach and education for homeowners and professionals in Pierce County, Washington. From 2013 to 2018, Geoff served as coordinator of the Arboretum's Grassroots Initiative, which includes a 1.3-acre interactive turfgrass exhibit, a website, and ongoing homeowner lawn maintenance workshops in the spring and fall. His experience has also included working on golf courses in the landscape industry in Maryland, Colorado, Washington State, and Hawaii. Geoff joined the University of Maryland as a lecturer in the Institute of Applied Agriculture in July 2017, teaching courses in landscape and turfgrass management. Today, Geoff will present using NTEP data to select turfgrass varieties for sports fields. Please help me welcome Geoff Rinehart.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I appreciate it. I appreciate being here. Thank you so much to SFMA for the invitation to present on NTEP data and variety selection for use for sports fields. Go ahead and can't advance here. Oh, sorry. There I go. Okay, now I can advance. So first thing I want to talk about is the fact that, of course, we've had as turfgrass managers, we're battling pests and other pressures on our turf grasses. And I just found these articles from some very early turfgrass publications, and it's talking about fighting June beetles with caddies and going out and collecting June beetles. And of course, we think about brown patch as one of our major diseases, especially on tall fescue. Of course, it's been going, we've been dealing with brown patch since kind of the dawn of turfgrass research. It's an interesting article here looking at, brown patch back on the Arlington experimental turf gardens. Just an interesting note was that some of the first turfgrass research occurred in Arlington. Now we're basically on where the Pentagon is located there in Northern Virginia. So point I'm trying to make though is that what's old is new, and we've been still dealing with these pests in our modern times. Obviously, we have a lot more tools in the toolbox to approach these than we did several decades ago. But one of the keys here is correct variety and turfgrass species selection. So I want to point out that within the Sports Field Managers Association Best Management Practices Manual, this is obviously a wonderful document that was worked on diligently by many people. But within this particular document, part of it talks about turfgrass establishment, and within that, turfgrass selection. So I'm going to kind of concentrate my comments today on turfgrass selection, and realizing that really the foundation of best management practices of integrated pest management is really selecting the best variety and the best species for that area and for that sports field pitch. So you see within this, I've kind of screenshot the first page and talks a little bit about the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program here, as well as what we call the A-List, the Alliance for Low Input Sustainable Turf, and the Turfgrass Water Conservation Alliance. So most of my comments today will be looking at the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program and how sports field managers can use that data to better inform themselves when selecting species and varieties. So if we take a step to just kind of think about what's important in our attributes for a turf grass for a sports field, there's several things come to mind. So, in no particular order, I've listed several of these, and I've got another, I think, short slide of this to follow. But we think about density being incredibly important. When we think about density, that kind of leads into thinking about safety issues. If we have a dense stand of desirable turf grass, that gives us a better chance of providing safe playing conditions as well as good playability for that sport which is being played. And then certainly uniformity too. We know that there's some data out there looking at, if you're going from different different densities. If you go from a kind of a dense playing surface to one that's kind of sparse and that footing is different, that can kind of lend into possibility of injuries. So we want density and then that uniformity to be foremost as some of the things that we look at for safety attributes in a sports field. And then as we go down the list here, obviously texture is important for playability. A soccer ball is going to play different on a broad textured turf grass than on a finer textured turf grass. But we also look at wear tolerance and recuperative capacity. So I'll differentiate those and say that wear tolerance refers to a grass's innate capability of withstanding that foot traffic and being able to maintain in a dense fashion. And then recuperative capacity refers to the ability of a grass to recover once it is worn down and that density is worn down. How well does it recover? And so those are important characteristics as well. And then as we look down, we look at some of the stress tolerances. So obviously heat tolerance, drought tolerance is a bigger issue nowadays with oftentimes premiums placed on water usage and trying to make sure our irrigation is as efficient as possible. But we also look at pest resistance, and that's going to include not only weed resistance related to density, but also disease resistance and insect resistance. And then some other attributes that we look at, we're going to include mowing height. So obviously the growth habit of the plant is going to relate to what the optimal mowing height is for that particular species. Color, while important, I would argue that density and uniformity and recuperative capacity are more important than just color. And then resilience, this pertains to how the grass kind of bounces back after having an impact, whether that's foot traffic or a ball bounce for soccer, for those for that pitch, and then persistence or not. So if we look at, typically our cool season grasses, we want that grass to be persistent and develop a, perennial stand that is capable of withstanding a variety of stresses over time. If you're looking at overseeding Bermuda grass with perennial ryegrass, then you want that perennial ryegrass to last through the winter, but then not be persistent as you get into the springtime, as you're trying to transition back to Bermuda grass. So these are just a few of the attributes and characteristics that we as sports turf managers look at when selecting species and cultivars. So with this, we look at the next thing to think about too is management capabilities. So if we look at cultivar selection, we need to look at, what is our budget, both labor and monetarily, and think about how many fertilizer applications we going to be able to make? Are we going to be able to sustain that turf grass for the nutrient requirements that it needs to maintain that dense stand? We also think about mowing regime. So obviously higher end facilities typically have more money and then have that money to have a real mower and to mow more often. And if you have a real mower and can mow more often, you're going to be able to mow at a shorter mowing height. And so that affects playability. Certainly if you're at a Parks and Rec or high school, lower to medium budget, you're probably not going to have a real mower, probably going to have to be mowing a little bit higher with the rotary mower. But all of that affects our management capability for those grasses. And obviously water availability is an issue in all parts of the country, some parts more so than others, but our water availability is important. So we look at, can we find grasses that are more drought tolerant, that use water more efficiently. And so you also look at environmental conditions. Usually for sports fields, we don't have too much shade, but you as a sports field manager might be managing other areas of the landscape as well, and that might include some areas that are shady. And then thinking about soil conditions, whether you have a sand-based field or a native field or a sand-capped field, all of those are going to affect the way that you manage that field, and may affect the species selection that you have for those fields. And then certainly looking at what type of sports are played on that field, what is the intensity of that play during a given season, and when are those sports played, what time of year. I know that many of our high use fields have very little break time. You might get a month, or in the cool season part of the country, you might get a month or two of a break, where those fields aren't scheduled. So obviously further north, it's going to be a little bit longer, but all of these to think about the types of sports that are on that field, the intensity, and the time of year on which those sports are played, during which those sports are played, are important. So we think about kind of relating this variety selection to integrated pest management, and think about what is a turfgrass pest. And one way to define this would be any organism causing a measurable deterioration in the aesthetic or functional value of a turf. And obviously for sports field managers, the most important thing is looking at safety. And so obviously density, uniformity, and the ability of that turf grass to persist and provide a quality, consistent footing for that sport is very important within sports field management. So we think about the three primary categories of turfgrass pests, and these are going to include weeds. One general definition of that is a plant out of place. These can include broadleaf perennials, broadleaf annuals, and annual or perennial grassy weeds as well. We also think about diseases, and a disease is a biotic organism, usually referred to as a pathogen, which causes a decline in another organism. And then insect pests. It's important to remember that the vast majority of insects that we have in a turfgrass system have no effect on the turf or are beneficials, and our beneficial insect pests can actually help us to be predators on the, I should say beneficial insects can help to be predators on the pest insects. And really in the grand scheme of things, just a few feet on turfgrass roots, stems, or leaves. So we think about these turfgrass pest categories, and when we're thinking about pest tolerance in relationship to species selection and cultivar selection, again, that grass selection is really foundational to how we approach this integrated pest management in the long term. So one definition of IPM would be the selection, integration, and implementation of pest control based on predicted economic, ecological, sociological consequences. So we know that, obviously we function within the broader community, not just having sports fields in isolation, but certainly having broader community considerations when we look at our integrated pest management programs. Another definition, maybe perhaps a little bit more specific, would be a system of controlling pests in which pests are identified, action thresholds are considered, and all possible control options are evaluated. And thusly, the selected controls are implemented, which have the least adverse effect to the environment. So both of these definitions, I think, are pretty pertinent. And if we look at, this is not an IPM talk per se, but I think it's very important to consider, certainly when we're looking at variety selection. So if we look at our turfgrass maintenance practices, we think about what's been called primary cultural practices. A lot of times you'll hear academics kind of talk about these primary cultural practices, and typically thought of as 5 primary cultural practices. I've added in variety selection as a 6th because, again, I feel like it's so foundational and really key to maintaining a sports field in a way that provides quality playing conditions, but also provides the best grass for that particular area. So we think about variety selection. Of course, we think about mowing, we think about watering, fertilizing, and then this concept of cultivation, which aerating and thatching are 2 cultivation practices that are commonly used. And then the idea is that if we can do these 5 things correctly and really build our foundation on stronger grasses, and then do all of these other cultural practices, that we're spending less time on that last one, which is pest management. And so in that sense, the variety selection for stronger, more pest tolerant, drought tolerant, stress tolerant grasses is incredibly important. And obviously it's easy to think about this if you're building a new facility or if you're doing a total renovation. But also I would encourage you to think about this as you're interseeding or overseeding, or doing partial renovations. As you're seeding on a year-to-year basis, can you work in more improved varieties? Because we've got better varieties now than we did 10 or 15 years ago. Certainly, I think I'm kind of looking at a lot of the cool season species, warm season species as well. Obviously, it's not as easy to kind of interseed warm season species. We don't have as much seed choices for Bermuda grass. So cool season grass is a little bit easier to do that interseeding and changing with varieties. So we think about the integrated pest management pyramid and think about this concept of prevention. Obviously, we want to try to avoid bringing weed seeds into the area. And when we're purchasing seed, thinking about high quality seed with very little crop seed, very little weed seed. And in fact, if we can spend the money to buy certified, blue tag certified seed, gives us the best opportunity to establish that grass with a minimal of weeds in that particular stand. So that relates to sanitation as well. And then the cultural practices were those 5 primary cultural practices that I spoke briefly about the previous slide. We also think about physical and mechanical controls. For insects, we've got some biological controls. We've got a couple biological controls for diseases as well. And then relying on these 4 things before we proceed to our chemical control. So our foundation should be built on the biological, physical control, cultural practices, and prevention. So that's the idea of the integrated pest management pyramid. And we think about identifying the pest, we think about establishing damage thresholds, monitoring for the pests, looking at cultural control practices, certainly mechanical control if feasible, for weeds, and then obviously looking at use of less toxic products, biorationals, and spot treatment if possible within an integrated pest management program. So today we're going to kind of focus the rest of the talk on this concept of variety selection. Of course, we know that the population, slide is a little old, but I think the point is that the population of our country is still going up. We see popularity, especially of youth sports, going up. And so there's going to be more and more pressure on sports field managers to provide high quality playing conditions with increased play pressure in many of our communities. So we think about sustainability and this concept of a Venn diagram, bringing in the economic feasibility of what we do. We're all working, or I'd say 99% of us are probably working with a budget. But we've got to have those economic considerations. Certainly, we're cognizant of the environment around us and within our communities, and how sports fields play an important role in that environment and providing safe recreational spaces. But the way that we maintain those sports fields is important because it can have impacts on the environment around those facilities. And then obviously social aspects as well. So this relates more into sociological attitudes towards, towards sports and fields. So kind of in that middle spot there is this concept of sustainability. So what we're doing on a short, mid, and long-term basis needs to find some aspect of sustainability where we're considering the environment, considering economic issues, and of course, considering social aspects of what we're doing as well. And so when we think about turf sustainability, we're thinking about using inputs carefully, obviously enhancing and protecting the environment, protecting and enhancing human health and safety, and really, obviously, safe playing surface is the most important thing that we can provide to the athletes who use our fields. And then, aesthetics, kind of as a second important thing, that safety of the playing surface is the most important thing. And you all are being asked to do this in a cost-effective manner, which is no small task. So, again, I kind of set the stage here because I feel like proper species selection and selection of improved varieties within those species, the selected species, are a real key component to try to move towards this concept of turf sustainability. So we think about reduced or careful fertilizer applications. We think about drought tolerance, capabilities of resisting weed invasion. That ties back into density that I spoke about several slides ago. Obviously, traffic tolerance is an important aspect of this. If we can get more games on a certain grass and that grass doesn't wear out or it wears out more slowly, then that's going to be helpful in providing those high quality playing conditions. Overall turf quality is obviously important, and disease and insect resistance. And other factors that we consider too are fast establishment, how if you've got a grass with stolons or rhizomes, how fast is that grass spread out? What's the winter tolerance of that grass? Can we get away with some reduced mowing? So those are all factors that go into this concept of sustainability needs within turfgrass management. And so that leads us to a little bit of discussion about the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program. This program was started as part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture based in Beltsville, Maryland in 1980, and has since been kind of spun off into its own nonprofit. And of course, as mentioned, this is housed at Beltsville Ag Research Center, which is in suburban Maryland, just a few miles from Washington, D.C. And so we think about some of what it takes to select different varieties, to find different varieties of grasses. And so some of the ways this has been done have been through ecotype selections. And those ecotype selections refer to plants that are kind of found in nature naturally, that researchers go and search for these. And if they find a grass that has increased density, seems to be persisting well in a very low management type of site, they might take collections from that and then propagate those further in the effort to develop a new variety. So a lot of our older properties, old golf courses, old cemeteries, old lawns, a lot of these you look at, okay, well, why has this grass persisted that long, in kind of a maybe low management type of a situation. Turfgrass breeders and selectors are interested in finding these ecotype selections. Now, this may not be as common as it was decades ago, but it can still occur. Examples of this would be Meyer zoysia grass and some of our older Kentucky bluegrasses and bent grasses. So, of course, many times in modern times, you're looking at different attributes of different grasses and then crossing those to try to breed through traditional breeding techniques a better grass. So for instance, if you've got a grass with very good density, but maybe not great drought tolerance, and you've got another selection with good drought tolerance, but maybe not great density, you're able to cross those to develop a new variety and then test that variety. That's how a lot of our varieties are developed nowadays. So we look at this turfgrass improvement, older photo here, looking at turf green Bermuda, where older Bermudas couldn't be mowed as low, and so you've got that selection of a better quality playing surface, more playability with that lower mowing on those Bermudas. And then really our key important thing that we look at is this concept of quality, and this kind of integrates a number of factors between density and color and stress tolerance, pest tolerance, verdure, how much green tissue is growing above that soil level. And so this quality kind of integrates a number of attributes that researchers are looking at. And so I think a lot of people have been to university turfgrass field days where you've seen plots like this, where you have approximately 4 by 6 foot plots that have grasses that are replicated usually 3 times in a randomized fashion. And so this gives us an opportunity as researchers to look at these side by side over a number of years and be able to gain evaluation data for these turf grasses, and certainly turfgrass quality, where we're combining a number of attributes and characteristics is an important part of this. So you look at, again, a little bit of older pictures here, but I don't want us to take for granted what, previous researchers have done with regards to looking at evaluating these varieties and being able to provide data on this so that seed companies and practitioners can select the best varieties of a given species based upon the attributes that they desire. And so some of what this entails are descriptive characteristics. In the middle there, you've got 2 zoysias. For those who are familiar with zoysia, we have some different species of zoysia. So zoysia japonica, which you see here on the left, is a rougher texture. Typically, it's mowed a bit higher. And on the right here, you see a finer textured zoysia. These are zoysia matrella or zoysia tenuifolia types. And if you cross those, you're going to have a finer textured zoysia. But obviously, with the finer texture, you can mow these lower. And so these zoysias are being used on golf courses. Not a lot of zoysias being used on sports field, but I know there's interest in evaluating zoysia grasses for sports field. So looking at these descriptive characteristics are an important part of turfgrass research. This happens to be a chinch bug that is a surface feeding insect usually on Kentucky bluegrass, and causes these large irregularly shaped patches. In the early days of when endophytes were first introduced, it was found that endophytes, which are a beneficial fungus which are within the plant, are helpful for reducing feeding from surface feeding insects, including chinch bugs. And so we take some of this for granted for now, but we're able to kind of impart that insect tolerance on a grass when we find that they have endophytes in that grass. And so an important part of cultivar evaluation again. So within the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program trials, there's over hundreds of over 600 grasses being tested. They've looked at 20 different species over the years. Typically, you'll see these at university research plots. And also, I might note that a lot of universities have on-site trials where they might go out to a off-campus and plant these trials where they're actually being used or trafficked as well. Typically, these are put out in 3 replications, and usually the testing period is for 5 years. So for cool season grasses, you would plant in the fall of a given year and then evaluate those grasses for establishment and then subsequently for quality and other attributes over the course of 5 growing seasons. And then progress reports based upon a collection of this data nationally are released on an annual basis. So obviously ratings are done during the growing season. These are compiled and then sent to NTEP during the December-January period. And then these progress reports are developed. And then at the end of that 5 years, those progress reports are compiled further into a final report that is released at the end of each test. So it's important to realize that these tests go on for 5 years. And the reason for that is because they give researchers an opportunity to really kind of look at some of the midterm and kind of project into the long term how these grasses will react. For instance, if you have a grass that if you only had a 2-year trial and you had a grass that was very quick to establish and did well for 2 years, you can't necessarily assume that it's going to do well in the long term. So we have had varieties before that germinate very quickly and then really don't provide adequate quality during that 5-year period after they've become established. Likewise, there's been grasses that establish slowly, but have really shown a lot of great persistence and stress tolerance over the course of 5 years. So while we'd like to continue tests longer, 5 years has kind of been determined as the kind of the sweet spot of evaluating grasses to kind of predict for the long-term performance, but be able to integrate new varieties into new trials every 5 years. And so don't hold me to the exact geography of this map here, but this gives you a general representation of areas of the country which have NTEP trials. So you'll see a number of these occurring in the eastern half of the country, and that kind of stands to reason as a lot of our population is in the eastern half of the country. But as you get further into the plains and then into the Intermountain West, it's important because a lot of different stresses in those parts of the country. And then obviously you're going to have different stresses in the south than in the northeast. So the hope of the NTEP program is to really have a variety and have a number of varieties within a test and test these across the country, because inevitably you'll have some varieties that might do well in certain regions, but not as well in other regions. Sometimes you do have varieties that do well nationwide, but this regionality of the testing is very important. And so these are, again, don't hold me to this exact geography, but this is a pretty good representation of where tests are done. The other thing that I'd like to note on here is that if you're in a state that doesn't have an NTEP trial, or even if you are, it's also important to look at nearby states to see how these grasses perform within your region. So those are important considerations when looking at performance data of given varieties. And so you have general tests, but then you can also test specific situations. So in this instance here, we have a rainout shelter. So during our drought study that was done, cool season grasses a few years ago, the researchers in the east built these high tunnels, which were covered with plastic and keep the rain out, to be able to dry these grasses down and evaluate them based on that dry down. In the west, where we're not so, we don't have as much rainfall, they were irrigated at different percentages of evapotranspiration and then evaluated. So there's different ways to conduct these drought tests. You can also have fungicide, or pardon me, disease, ancillary disease trials, where a fungicide might be applied in half the plot, but not in the other half of the plot. You can see with this example, you have a lot stronger variety here on the left, where the no fungicide application still looking pretty good, whereas here on the right, this particular one is pretty beat up by that disease. So there's different ways that these trials can be conducted, and splitting those plots for treatment might be one way that the researchers do that. Of course, in sports fields, traffic is a very important consideration for evaluating varieties. So there are locations that do traffic simulation. Typically, these are done just for a given period of weeks to maybe simulate a season of sports play. And then the traffic is done kind of down along the border of the plot, so that you have half the plot being trafficked and half the plot not being trafficked. Two commonly used traffic simulators include the Brinkman traffic simulator. Here you see these metal cylinders that are pretty heavy. This is on a tow behind unit, and they have these spikes, cleats, if you will, kind of welded into these cylinders. And so you can imagine this would simulate cleat traffic on a soccer or football field. And so there's different approximations for how many passes equals how many games based on this Brinkman traffic simulator. And then we know also that not only this compaction is an important part of traffic, but also abrasion. So this is instrument out of Rutgers that doesn't, it's not compacting so much as it's abrading, kind of slapping and abrading that grass surface. So there's different ways of evaluating, these traffic with these use of traffic simulators in a research capacity. So for an example here, you see how this traffic was done right along the border, so that you have half of each plot on either side being trafficked. So you've got a lot of traffic down, or you got a lot of turfgrass loss here, but you look at this variety here, looking like it's withstanding that traffic pretty well. Those are the types of things that researchers, like to see, and kind of, obviously this data is collected for that, but if we can find a handful of varieties out of several dozen within a test, that's very meaningful, because you're putting these to the test as a researcher, trying to identify the best varieties under a variety of stresses for the turfgrass manager. Another example might be Kentucky bluegrass. A big disease of Kentucky bluegrass is summer patch in a lot of the country. And so this particular variety seems to be pretty resistant to summer patch. So that's important data to know, as summer patch is a difficult disease to manage, as it is a root disease where the grass becomes infected during the springtime, but you might not see symptoms develop until the summertime. So a lot of these root diseases, especially the root patch diseases, are very difficult to manage in that regard. So finding better tolerance for Kentucky bluegrasses, should say resistance for bluegrasses to summer patch is important. Wanted to show you an aspect of where those drought studies were located. So you can see here with the little houses, we've got cool season and warm season based on the yellow or red. In the east, we had those rain out shelters because we typically have pretty ample rainfall. So we wanted to exclude that rainfall. And then in the west, you typically do not have ample rainfall. So you don't need a rain out shelter. You just set up your irrigation so that you're looking at different percentages of evapotranspiration when evaluating these varieties. And so this is from Mateo out west, and really looking at a lot of grasses in not very good shape, and then these grasses in better shape based on irrigation regime. So typically they will dry these down for a period of time, usually 3 months, based on those reduced irrigation regimes, and then try to water for recovery and see what recovers. So as researchers, we're really putting these grasses to the test, and we want to see that separation and be able to select the best grasses. It's another view of the rain out shelter. This happens to be at the University of Maryland, where I work, where we would have this to keep rain off of these plots. This happens to be at the very beginning of the study, where all the varieties are looking pretty good, but that dry down will occur over time. So that brings us to the National Turf Evaluation Program website. And in my travels, I know that there's some people who are familiar with this, some people are not familiar with this, but really this website gives an opportunity to kind of delve into a lot of the data that's been collected for NTEP. And so if you go to ntep.org, you will come to that homepage there, and then go ahead and take a look. So for instance, if we're in a situation where we're managing Kentucky bluegrass and we want to take a look at some of the data for the bluegrasses, I'm going to go into this particular section. Let's go ahead and select a species. And for this, we find Kentucky bluegrass. So for this, we've got our summary data. So this is presented as the 2017 National Bluegrass Test for the 2018 to 22 data. So you might say, well, where's the 2017 data? So basically, again, for these cool season grasses, they are usually planted in the fall and then evaluated for 5 years after that during the growing seasons. So that the full-fledged data collection didn't really start until 2018, as this test was planted in fall of 2017. And while the most recent is probably the most pertinent, you can actually go back and sort through some of the previous tests as well. Okay, so let's look at, in this particular test, we had a high input bluegrass test and a low input bluegrass test. Obviously, bluegrass traditionally has been a medium to high maintenance grass. And so one of the things that we look at is, can we find cultivars that can provide good, adequate playing conditions, good, adequate quality, density, etc., but with lower inputs. And so in this particular season or round of tests, we did a high input and a low input Kentucky bluegrass test. So let's look at the low input. Let's go to the final data there. And if we go to this, we've got all the data that are compiled for those 5 years. And we've got this table of contents. So we could look at drought tolerance. We could look at living ground cover data. We could look at density data. So let's just say that we want to try to look at diseases, insects here. And within diseases and insects, obviously, summer patch is a big issue in a lot of our bluegrasses. So let's look at the summer patch data. Again, just kind of clicking through. I made these screenshots. So if we look at this, we can look at not every location took specific summer patch ratings, but those locations that did, North Carolina, New Jersey, and Oklahoma, have their data listed here. So if we look at how these are evaluated, our scale is from 1 to 9. So 9 would be no disease on that plot. 1 would be basically dead because it's been devastated by disease. And we see that for this group of data, the ratings range from 3.4 to 7.7. And then you see that they've calculated the mean across these different locations. And so this gives you an idea if summer patch is, an important consideration, which a lot of times in the transition zone in northern parts of the country, summer patch is an important consideration when selecting bluegrasses. You can use this data to kind of inform your variety selection for these bluegrasses. We can go through and kind of look at this a little bit more too. Here's our Schedule B, which is our low input selection. So we've got reduced water, reduced fertilizer. This is from my university in College Park. 1 to 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. Little to no irrigation. So I think the protocol was to irrigate to prevent drought, or prevent severe drought, I think it was. So this had reduced water, reduced fertilizer. And so, you can see some differences here in summer 2012, maybe not as much in 15, but then you get to fall 2016, pretty dry year, and these aren't getting irrigated very much. Your eye kind of is drawn to these varieties in the foreground as better drought tolerance than a lot of the varieties in this trial. So again, as researchers, we're really putting these grasses to the test. If we're maintaining everything where everything looks good, then that doesn't really tell us much about varieties that are more tolerant and resistant of our stresses. So if we look at this data here, we look at turfgrass quality ratings. And so across this, looking at Iowa, Indiana, Maryland, Utah, again, coming up with means there for that. These were maintained for Schedule B, which is lower maintenance, looking at 3-inch mowing height, 0 to 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 per year, and then no irrigation after establishment. So again, good data there from these locations. Advance here. Oh, goodness. Okay. Just going to kind of breeze through these a little bit. You can go through there and also look at drought tolerance. This happens to be from Kentucky in 2019. And so you could kind of pull these different attributes together, and I'll show you a program that kind of does some of this within the NTEP program. But just wanted to show an example. You can do this for any species that you're interested in. So for instance, if we have Bermuda grass, a couple of the attributes we're interested in would be traffic tolerance, winter hardiness, quality, spring dead spot resistance. And so you can kind of go through and kind of analyze these groups of attributes and kind of create this table. So if we look at this a little bit more, percent recovery from drought, so all sorts of good information here. This happened to be in Maryland, looking at, we had this drought in 2016, like I showed you in the photo a few slides ago. How well did this recover? And so this is important to note with these varieties. So if we look at drought tolerance, same type of thing, you're looking at specific locations that have evaluated drought tolerance, and you can find this data on the NTEP site. So the question becomes, what if we're interested in multiple attributes, how do we kind of look at those attributes together? And so recently, within the last year and a half, NTEP has kind of developed this Turfgrass database here. So you see right below the Facebook logo there. And so you go to that, and this is kind of version 1.0. I've spoken with the executive director of NTEP, and this is something they're working on to try to improve, but wanted to try to get out this version 1 of this NTEP Turfgrass Trial Explorer. So within this, you can go into this program and you can choose a cultivar or a particular trial. You can choose a variable. So if you're looking at different attributes, and then you can filter these by site characteristics and management practices. So if you're looking for a low input, you don't have, you're looking for a lower input bluegrass, gives you an opportunity to be able to see what the data is saying for these lower input bluegrasses. So for instance, if you go through here again, I just did some screenshots of examples where we're back into the 2017 Kentucky Bluegrass test. We're looking at summer patch as an important consideration. We're also looking at drought tolerance as an important consideration. And then we're looking at quality during the summer months. So those were the 3 attributes that I chose to be able to compare side by side by side. And as you can tell here, without going into the live website, you can choose a variety of different attributes that are important to you. And so with this, if you can choose up to 3 for now, but you can look at this and it compiles the data to where you have the side-by-side comparison of these different characteristics for each of the varieties that are within that particular trial. Now, it also produces these numbers that are called coefficient of variation, or CV, as well as LSD, which stands for the least significant difference. And so you see these calculated for each of these categories here. And so I'll note for least significant difference, this is the numerical difference, which is a statistically real difference. So when we're looking at the statistics of these analyses, if the difference is lower than the least significant difference, then there's really no statistically significant difference between the numerical values. So in other words, if you're only 0.1 away with that rating, if you only have 0.1 separation, that's not statistically significant. And so we want to be able to look at real differences that are further apart than this least significant difference number. Coefficient of variation refers to how what type of kind of data spread we had within that data. But I think the more important thing to look at is that least significant difference, or LSD number. And so again, you can go through there and choose different different species. This happens to be the 2013 National Bluegrass test for the 2017 data. And you look at this at several different sites. So again, that kind of brings up a point that I made earlier. You would certainly want to look at your state's NTEP data, but also states data within your region to get a better idea of how these cultivars have performed. And so one of the things that NTEP is working on to develop is integrating all of the varieties that have ever been tested within the NTEP program over the course of the decades that it's been in place. And so you can see here, It's got the name, the commercial name. I will make a note, a lot of times you'll see, especially earlier in a trial, you'll see the experimental names. And these are the experimental designations that have been given to that variety by the seed company. Sometimes you'll see that experimental name change to a commercial name when that variety becomes commercially available and on the commercial market. So this is being worked on soon to be kind of a better or an opportunity to go back and get variety data from years ago. The other thing that I'll mention too, as we kind of wrap up here, and I know I'm close on time, is there are other variety evaluation programs. NTEP is the one that's been around for the longest, and I would contend is the most robust with cooperation through universities nationwide. Other organizations that cooperate with university researchers nationwide and are also good sources for information would be the A-List. This is the Alliance for Low Input Sustainable Turf. So as we're looking more at saving on fertilizer, saving on water, try to reduce pest incidents and use of pesticides, these being able to look at these data collections is very important as you're choosing your varieties for either a renovation or for overseeding and interseeding to get better varieties integrated into your field. So we've got the A-List, and then also Turfgrass Water Conservation Alliance, TWCA. So this is another organization that does testing, primarily looking at reducing water uses, and they cooperate with a number of university researchers as well. So with that, I'd like to wrap up the presentation. I wanted to thank you for attending. There's my email contact, my X, or formerly Twitter handle there, at GJ Rinehart. And if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I think I have a minute or two, Jennifer.
So if you have a question, you can drop it in the chat. We've got a few minutes left.
And I know that we're recording this to have available to people in the future. So obviously at that point, you can email me as well if you're watching this on a recording in the future.
Okay, doesn't look like we have any questions today. Thank you, Geoff. That was a wonderful presentation. And as you said, we will have this available on the SFMA website, on the conference page, as well as part of our library. Thank you very much. I appreciate everything that you've done today and all the great information that we have. And thank you to our participants as well.
Thank you.